Is that coming through? There we go. Now we're working. Welcome. I am Carla Faust. I am here on behalf of our Lodi Optimist Club. Ann Groves Lloyd is our new president, but Ann is out of town today, so I am hosting the forum on her behalf and on behalf of the Lodi Optimists. We are very excited to do this presentation today. It is with retired senators Tim Cullen and Dale Schultz. What you're going to hear today is gerrymandering and the redistricting maps that are currently going on since our census completion. So in a little bit here we're going to start. We will open it up for Tim to start with his presentation. Dale will follow, and then we will open it up for questions. Once we get to questions, I am more than happy to come around with a mic and be able to put it in front of you so everyone can hear your questions. We appreciate some high school students being here today. Thank you for joining us. Before we start, whenever we have an Optimist meeting, we all rise and state the Pledge of Allegiance. So if you could please all stand, face the flag. I pledge allegiance. You know, the most interesting thing about that is I can recite that until I have to do that in front of a bunch of people. So with that, Alice, do you have some? Just going to give you something there. All right, with that, I will let them do even more proper introductions and let them introduce themselves as well. So we will start with you. I'm going to assume you want to stand. I'm going to assume you want to stand.
Sure. Well, thank you, Carla. My name is Tim Cullen. I'm from down in Janesville, and I think this is the second time actually Dale and I have been in Lodi, but it's great to be here. Beautiful school, and what a growing community when you drive out here by the high school and the middle school. Dale and I are, I can speak for him, we're pleased to be here. We've actually done this kind of talk over 100 times. We actually lost track since 2013, so we weren't like doing it all in 3 weeks. But we saw the gerrymander in 2011. But we didn't truly know the impact of it until there was an election under those maps, which occurred in 2012. And 2012 was a fairly good Democratic year in Wisconsin. Barack Obama was reelected president. Yet the legislature, because it had been gerrymandered, because usually if there's no gerrymander, the top of the ticket results will generally be reflected at the legislative level. Democrats win at the top of the ticket, or Republicans, whichever one wins the big top of the ticket statewide races. Usually that's about what happens at the legislative level if the maps are drawn fairly. Well, Barack Obama gets 54% of the vote, and the Republicans got 2/3 of the state assembly. And so we both realized really what had happened, and Dale and I got together and said, well, what can we do about it? And we were both former majority leaders, either party. We thought, well, we can go around the state and maybe we'll have some credibility because we're together on the same side of this issue. And people, lots of groups that didn't want to get in trouble for, get some kind of hassle because they invited a Democrat to come and talk about something or just a Republican. They kind of got rid of that mess because they had us both. So they could be, half could get mad at me and half could get mad at Dale, but that was okay. But the big thing that we try to talk about is why, and I'm presuming that pretty much the audience is familiar with the word gerrymandering and what it means. Is everybody pretty familiar with what that word means and where it came from and so on? In 2013, Dale and I had to start out with telling everybody who Elbridge Gerry was and how we got the word gerrymandering, but by 2017 or so, people knew what was going on. But the big thing is is that all of us care deeply about different issues. It could be that we care about guns, or we could care about abortion, or pay for public education, or health care. Those are what I call visceral issues. Those really get us interested because we care deeply about them, whatever side we're on with those issues. Big thing that gerrymandering does is gerrymandering means that the legislature never gets to a point where they act on those issues sort of in the best interest of the whole state. They either won't deal with them, or they deal with them from an extreme position. And so people get frustrated. Why doesn't the legislature act reasonable on this issue or that issue or that issue? And almost all the time, it comes back to gerrymandering. Because people didn't think of gerrymandering as a visceral issue. When we first started out, people would say, well, that's just what those politicians in Madison do. So, you know, what's the big deal? They draw the maps and they look out for themselves and so on. And we've just tried to make the point that when you have a system, which we have in Wisconsin, which we had in 2011, where when they drew the maps with all the zigs and zags, they get this part of this township, or this part of this ward, or this part of this block. Literally, they got so sophisticated they could say, well, there's too many of this party in that block. We want that in the Democratic district, or we want it in a Republican district. They got that sophisticated, and now 10 years later, they're going to be even more sophisticated if we have gerrymandering. We also point out that gerrymandering is not a partisan issue. And people go, what do you mean it's not a partisan issue? The Republicans, look what they did in 2011. Well, it is not a partisan issue. Gerrymandering is an abuse of power issue. And it happens when one party controls the governorship and both houses of the legislature. And it doesn't matter which party it is. If you want to go to Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, I'll show you really good, powerful Republican gerrymanders. But I can take you to Massachusetts and Maryland and Illinois, and I will show you just as bad Democratic gerrymanders as the Republican gerrymanders in other states. So that's why we say it's an abuse of power. So what Dale and I have concluded is that we looked at what they call the Iowa system, how they do it in Iowa. The main thing is you have to take the drawing of the maps out of the hands of the legislature. Because if there ever was a conflict of interest, think about this. If you can draw the maps in a way that makes your seat safe for the next 10 years, they're going to do it. But what a conflict of interest. How many of you, wherever you work, or in your classroom, how many of you in the classroom can decide your own grade? I think you might pick an A. And same where you work. If you could guarantee yourself a job, unless you own the company, you can't do it. Well, legislators in a gerrymandered state can do that. They can guarantee themselves a job. In fact, the people who, with great sophistication, drew the maps in 2011 were asked to predict months in advance what was the likely percentage vote of the Republican and Democrat in the various districts where they had gerrymandered. And they predicted results that were within a 1% of what actually happened. So in other words, after gerrymandering happens, the results of an election are known the day that the maps pass. They're not decided on election day. The maps are drawn so that they guarantee a result. The majority party has to spread more of their voters over a majority of districts, so they have, like, the assembly's 99 seats, so they try to get 60 seats really gerrymandered. So that's what the Republicans do in a Republican gerrymandered state. Then they take the Democrats here and they stuff them all into a minority number of districts. So the Democrats are actually even safer than the Republicans. They don't have any power, but they can't lose their seat. So we watch all this, and Dale and I said, this just isn't right, and we're going to try to go around and make a difference. And I can tell you, not that we have made a difference, but the people of Wisconsin have woken up to this issue. We can tell it by the kinds of questions we got in 2013 versus the kinds of questions we were getting by 2017 or 2018. People have figured it out There have been referendums around the state, advisory referendums. There have been advisory referendums on county-wide referendums, and there's been referendums or votes just by the county board itself. But those are all passing by an average of 70%. I'm proud to say that in my home county of Rock County, it passed by 80%. When a referendum passes by 80%, that's not one party passing that referendum. That means that an awful lot of people in both parties and independents don't like it. And so we're for the Iowa system. You can tweak it a little bit if you want to. But basically, the person and agency in Iowa that drafts all the rest of the legislation that the Iowa legislature considers, they draft all the bills. That person is in charge of drafting the maps, because the maps end up in a bill, which the legislature deals with. And so that person has some instructions. They can't consider past election results when they're drawing a map. They can't even consider the home of the incumbent. They draw a fair map and the incumbent lives 6 blocks out of it. Tough luck. That's the way Iowa does it. And then the legislature has to vote on it, but they can't change it. So they can vote yes or no. If they vote no, which they did once, this happened, by the way, it started in 1980. So it's been going on for 40 years in Iowa. And Iowa loves it. But when if the legislature votes no, then that person who drew the maps, who was in charge of drawing the maps, can listen to their concerns. It may be legitimate. There may be something about this particular community that the Lions probably shouldn't have cut that part out or whatever. But he doesn't have to listen. He can send the same map right back to the legislature that they just rejected, or he can tweak it a little bit. Oh, and also, after he draws the maps, and it happens to be a man when I was dealing with them, they take the maps around the state for public hearings. So people can come and say, gee, there's this thing you didn't know about our community, and we think this makes a difference. And that person can listen to them and tweak it a little bit. But the legislature in Iowa has always, by the second time, passed the map in front of them. And so that shows that it's popular. And even more so, in 40 years, no legislator from either party of either house has even introduced a bill to change back to the system like most states have, like we have. Iowa loves it, and when a legislator won't even introduce a bill in either house of either party, that tells you that the people of Iowa like it, and we believe the people of Wisconsin would like it too. So that's what we hope happens. There's a whole other section to today, I think, and that is what's going to happen the rest of this year and early next year. What's going to happen for 2022? And I'm not going to say anything about that. Dale may want to. If Dale doesn't want to, we'll get to it for sure in questions, because we got some thoughts about that as well. So thank you very much.
I just want to begin by reassuring all of you that we do not agree on every subject, and we never have. And I can remember a lot of late nights and day-long debates about issues where we were on opposite sides. But at no time during that period of time would I have ever said that Tim Cullen wasn't my friend, or I wouldn't go and have lunch with him or dinner with him. That was our relationship and continues to be our relationship. And I think there are an awful lot of people, maybe a lot of folks here, who kind of wish politics operated like that still, because when you're so busy fighting each other, there isn't much time, and time is often precious, left to work on solutions for the kinds of things that bother people, whether it's not having enough to eat, worrying about whether or not taxes are going to go up, or school funding is going to go down, or important environmental issues will be taken care of. And I think it's important to make that point. If I were to ask you a question, how many of you are following this whistleblower issue on Facebook? Does anybody not know what that is? How about if I assume virtually all of you have Facebook or Instagram accounts, yes? Yeah, well, my kids do, and I happen to have neither, but that's a choice I make. Uh, if I say analytics, does that mean anything to anybody here? Do you know what that is? If you know what it is, put your hand up. I don't, well, that's pretty good. Every time you are on the internet and you access anything, you purchase anything, all of that data, what you did, where you did it, is accumulated. And there are people who are in the business of analyzing your data. You don't own that. It's owned by the companies you do business with, and that's usually contracted away. And these companies that deal with this, it's the science of analytics. And what do? They turn around and use that information to get you to use the internet more, or Facebook, or you know, some other platform more often. You ever notice that when you Google shoes because you want to purchase a pair of shoes, all of a sudden you start getting all kinds of ads for shoes? That's analytics at work. When I started in the legislature, I think I owned the second computer in the state capitol. I had an Apple IIe. I was really hot stuff. You know, everything in those days was done on a typewriter that belongs in a museum now, one of those IBM Selectrics with a ball on it that moved around. I expect most students here have never even seen one. And it made communications a little more challenging. But, you know, I remember for 10 years people said, you know, these computers haven't made us more efficient. They haven't really made that big a difference. And all of a sudden, bang, it began to happen. And you saw the advent of things like Facebook. Facebook has, what, over 3 billion customers now? I mean, they truly have linked us with the world. And just think about all of the data that they collect. And what they do with it is they sell it, they sell advertising, and around it goes. It gets ever faster and more vicious. It didn't take politicians very long to figure out that, boy, this could really be useful. And we could really, instead of just buying tons of airtime or newspaper ads, we could start targeting messages to individual voters. We could find out who they are and then target the message to them and play on their feelings, their biases, and we could motivate them if we did this right. And of course, what people have figured out over the years is that if you agitate people, you can get them to click more. And what happens when people click more? You get more advertising, and those companies make more money. And I don't know if you've noticed, people are kind of angry out there. I mean, you don't want to go to church, as you know, people won't sit with you anymore. Service clubs, people drop out because they don't like the people's politics there. You know, it's sad. It's just driven people apart. And that's kind of why, on a bipartisan basis, some folks in Congress are beginning to look at this and to blow the whistle. And you've seen some employees come forward, both in this country and in the UK, to point out that, in fact, the company executives are keenly aware of the impact that they have on particularly, I mean, everybody, but particularly young people. And there's been a lot written about the impact on young girls and body shaming that comes along with it. And it's just, I mean, it's sick. It's perverse. The only way we're ever going to change this is to get involved in these issues. And gerrymandering is an issue that I think should become visceral, because Tim is absolutely right. No matter what you care about, what issue is important to you, you can't even address the issue unless you're given a fair chance in the process. And that was the thrust of the lawsuit that went up to the United States Supreme Court. We were trying to advance the argument that this whole process of gerrymandering was disenfranchising people or making some people's votes more valuable than other people. It was a good argument, and I will tell you, and as a non-attorney, you'll get an editorial comment here, they decided they didn't have a role to say anything, and this should be left up to the states. Well, that's nonsense. If you can't even begin to function in your state, how are you going to address a problem like this? So what we were faced with was what some of the justices said, go back and solve it politically. And so for those of us who began this fight in the legislature, we've stayed engaged, not because we have any self-interest, but because we love that process. We remember that process, and we know that it works, and it is what makes for American exceptionalism. The fact that we face our problems, that we talk about them, and we come to an agreement. Not authoritarian where somebody else decides for you. So what I'm trying to say to you is that again, whether it's the environment or healthcare or whatever that trips your trigger, your ability to address it in your constitutionally guaranteed right depends on you having a fair shot in the process. And that's really what this is all about. Now, I'm not going to keep talking here because, you know, Tim mentioned, I'm not going to try to explain what's happened other than to say, I think we looked this up beforehand, it's 55 counties have passed resolutions, and 32 have had countywide referendums, and averages have showed 70%. Among Democrats, I think we're about 80%, Republicans are around 60%, and independents are somewhere in the middle. So it doesn't matter whether you're of one party or the other, the people have figured this out, and they know in the long run it's not good for them. And they see the problems stack up around them, and we certainly see that if we watch the news at all or read the newspapers. And the way out of this is to begin to treat each other fairly and get back to the business of listening to one another and working together to solve the problems that we have in our society. So with that, we'd like to take some questions from you. Pop up here.
We'll have you stand and please just state your name.
Okay.
I'm Charlie Luthen. Gracious sakes, I feel like the Wizard of Oz.
Maybe I'll pay attention to the man behind the curtain.
My question is this. I heard recently that the legislature said that they promised to get maps approved by November 11th. What's your take on that? What's the next step? And what are the chances of getting fair maps?
Well, I'll go first and let Tim chime in. The one thing that neither of us have mentioned, which I think is hugely important, is that our governor, Governor Evers, has appointed a group of distinguished judges who then pulled together representatives from every congressional district to convene and to put together a map that they deem to be fair. It's a nonpartisan effort. And I think that, you know, a lot of people believe that they have done a good job. So that drawing is out there. People have also opened the door and said any citizen can draw a map if they want. And some citizens have submitted maps that they have drawn themselves. This is remarkably easy. And the political parties have, in their own interest, drawn maps or in the process of drawing maps as well. And yes, once again, the majority party has employed very expensive lawyers to assist in this process. And that's money that doesn't get spent on the environment, healthcare, or education. Where will this all come out? I'm going to let Tim answer that question because I think we're both of the same opinion, and I believe that it's going to be what's old is new, but I think the outcome may be different because we are clearly able to demonstrate that unlike legislators of 4, 5, 7 years ago saying that no one cares about this issue, that that's simply not true. People do care. And Tim, you want to chime in?
Sure. As you indicated, there's this likelihood that the legislature will pass their, whatever version of the maps they want to by November 11th. I think one thing is I wonder, how does this process go and when does it end and what's the likely outcome? First of all, time frame. This is going to start to be action, if you will, on November 11th, whatever day they pass their maps. And it'll all be over by probably at the latest April of next year, because they've got to get maps out there. When legislators file to run for a seat, they got to know what the heck, who's in their district and who isn't in the districts they're running in. So it's going to be, for politics, sort of a compact process, because the courts get involved and so on. But they will pass a map, the legislature, both houses, which highly unlikely will be acceptable to Governor Evers. Governor then vetoes that map, which is a bill, it's a piece of legislation. It's Assembly Bill 12 or whatever number it's going to have. Governor vetoes it, then it goes back to the legislature to see if they can override his veto. It takes 2/3 of both houses to override a veto. Republicans do not have 2/3 of either house. So presumably, all the Democrats vote to sustain the governor's veto, and that ends the legislative input into this process. That will be it before the end of this year. Then there will be what some people in the legal committee call the dash to the courthouse. Republicans are going to try to go to the state Supreme Court, and the Democrats will likely try to go to the federal courts. And there's some people would say, well, it's a state issue, why wouldn't it just be the state Supreme Court? And that's a fairly strong argument in a lot of ways. But there are federal laws on how elections must be run and what groups must be protected by the law, et cetera. And those are federal laws. So the federal courts have an argument that they're the ones that should do it. And we'll see. One of the things I think is going to make a difference this year is that the maps that Senator Schultz referred to, that were put together by the Fair Maps Coalition, because I thought those maps, that commission appointed by Governor Evers, I thought those maps might come out with a little bit of a Democratic tilt, to be frank with you. It doesn't look like that's what they did. And their maps look pretty fair. And so I think they're going to be an issue. They're going to get attention in the media, and state or federal courts are going to have to look at what those maps look like versus what the Republicans passed and was vetoed by the governor. So I think those maps are going to end up having an impact. Regarding whether the federal courts do this, it's worth looking back in history a little bit. When we had divided government, of course, you don't have a gerrymander with divided government because neither party is going to let the other party gerrymander the maps. So in 1981, 1991, and 2001, following those censuses of those years previous to that, the federal courts drew the maps in Wisconsin. And they did a pretty good job. First of all, these federal judges, they're appointed for life. They didn't want to be a federal judge to draw legislative maps. That was not their career hope. And so they did a pretty good job, to the extent that all the people in Wisconsin, vast majority of people in Wisconsin, never noticed. Neither party really complained a lot. And it's why the gerrymander in 2011 really didn't grab the people's attention for a while, because we were not used to seeing a gerrymander map. I've gone back the best I can. We did not have a gerrymander no sooner than 1950 would have been the last time we possibly had a gerrymandered map. So I don't know how old some of you are, but in 1950 I was 6 and I'm 77 today. So I don't think that anybody has stated any idea what a gerrymander was, basically, and that's why it hit so hard in 2011. But how the courts resolve it, no one can predict that, whether the federal court will prevail. Some people say, well, the Supreme Court's 4-3 appointed by, or one as Republican sort of candidate, so therefore it's going to be 4-3 for the Republicans. I'm not so sure of that. The Chief Justice is retiring next year, never running again. She may want She may be looking at her legacy and maybe want to just do the right thing. You never know. There's another judge up there, Judge Hagedorn, who's shown some independence at different times. We really don't know. If I were a Republican or a Democrat and just wanted a fair map, I think the fair place to go, or the more likely place to go to get a fair map, would be the federal courts. It's also worth pointing out one other thing about this, which doesn't often get touched on. By where people live in Wisconsin, by where Republicans live, and by where Democrats live, there is a Republican tilt. You put together the fairest map possible, and there's probably 1% to 1.5% tilt in favor of the Republicans, because Democrats are overwhelmingly jammed, as you all know, into Madison. They're jammed into Milwaukee and Beloit and a few other cities as well. And the Republicans tend to be spread out over more of the state and are more competitive in more parts of the state. And so you get the fairest map possible that would pass the almighty, for crying out loud, and you'd have a map that tilted Republican a little bit. But Dale and I can tell you from campaigning, if you're running in a district that's 51% the other party in 48 years or 49 years, or 52 of them in 48 years, 53 of them 47 years, you can win those districts. You got to have a good candidate, you got to have good issues, you got to have a good organization, blah, blah, blah. But they aren't at all impossible to win. But when the gerrymanders get up into the 57, 58% for one party, that's when you really can't win them without an overwhelming landslide for one party. And in today's politics, in today's world, I don't see any overwhelming landslides coming for either party for some time. I ran for the Senate the first time in 1974, and I ran in a district that was 58% Republican. And people said, "What are you doing that for? That's kind of silly." Well, I had a good friend, it turned out. I didn't know him, never met him, but his name was Richard M. Nixon. And I got into the race in 74, and then he resigned in August, and the nation just sort of swooped to the Democrats. And then in the fall, his successor, President Ford, pardoned President Nixon, and that drove the people even crazier. And so it was a hugely landslide Democratic year in 74, and I fortunately, with a lot of help from a lot of good supporters, was able to survive that. But I never got a chance to thank him, but probably Richard Nixon had more to do with me getting into office than I did or anybody else, but never got a chance to thank him. But that's a very unusual. You don't usually get landslides, especially in the way America is divided today. You're not going to see landslides. So how it come? You're sitting there saying, "Well, he never told us how it's going to come out." It's because I don't know. But it is going to get decided by probably April. It could slide to May. It gets awful tough, but probably by April, maybe even sooner. But whether it ends up being the federal court or the state court is the final say, no one knows that now either. But there's a lot of lawyers on both sides trying to figure that out. But there is at least going to be certainty within about 6 months or so, and we'll know what the districts are. So.
I just wanted to add one other quick comment. This is going to get worse. Just as we have seen each election after the next election, or after the past election, the gerrymanders get worse, and that the advantage to one political party or the other grows. And the reason for that is the power of computing has increased, geometrically, as has the amount of data. In fact, it's so bad now that those folks in that analytics industry can tell you how you're going to vote before you know yourself. It's just stunning. And as the amount of data piles up, as the computer power gets greater and greater, they're going to have pinpoint precision at drawing these districts. And you may not know that, basically no one gets defeated anymore. And the reason for that is of gerrymandering and the locking in nature of that primary election that we see now. And that deprives people of a real choice. All they can choose from is this extreme or this extreme that's necessary to keep the tribe together. Yes.
I'm Patty Herman. I'm with the Columbia County Fair Maps Coalition. There's a couple of things going on out there, and then it's going to lead to my question. So there is a question here. There's a Senate bill and an Assembly bill that are out there that supports a fair redistricting process. But the problem is right now we can't get those bills forward for a hearing. The people who are on those committees, the legislator, the people in power won't allow those bills to be heard. So, you know, as we're thinking about what we can do, certainly trying to get a hearing, a public hearing for those bills would be one thing. There's also a Columbia County redistricting committee. Each county has a redistricting committee that has to meet to produce the maps that then the municipalities react to. And there will be a hearing, a public hearing, on November 2nd at 6 p.m. in Portage. So people can go and have their voice heard. And my question then leading to this is, what do you suggest that people can do to get their voices heard on this issue? What can we do if we have an opinion on this issue? How can we be involved in this? And then I'll finish by saying I do have yard signs, and they're free to a good home. So if you want a yard sign, I've got them in my car. So again, my question, how can we as citizens get involved in this issue?
Well, first thing I would say is it's amazing how much you already are. Dale and I, we never seek invitations. We've always only gone where we've been invited. And and by the way, we never take any money for anything. We don't take money for gas or food or mileage or rooms or honorariums or whatever. We never take a dime for doing this. We wanted to make sure we did that from day one. But what we have found over these years is that there are all these small groups of people, sometimes not so small, in all different parts of this state who have formed groups. They're not attached to the Democratic Party or Republican Party. And it's amazing. You say, well, there's not that many people here today. Well, not that many people here today. If you multiply that to not very many people, 100 other places, and you start to have a lot of people. I think that, you know, newspapers are in deep trouble, I guess local papers particularly, but I think relatively short but succinct letters to the editor, I think still make a difference. Obviously, you can go online and use your access to whatever there to share people your view, but one of the things that we think is important is that people who think gerrymandering should stop are particularly important if they are in districts which are represented by a Republican today. Because if the Republicans don't hear much from people, then they'll go, well, the media doesn't like it, the Democrats don't like it, but I'm not hearing that much as a Republican legislator. Make sure they do. You can email their offices. They may not email you back. Don't feel bad about that. Email them again. It just constant attack, so they start to think about that, you know, gosh, there's all kinds of people. And if you know a person who is a friend of the legislator, which you may well do, get a hold of that person, see how they feel about gerrymandering. If they feel like you do about gerrymandering, get them to talk to their friend in the legislature. That you never know how that kind of thing happens, especially if it happens frequently. The big thing is, I wouldn't feel good if you left here today thinking that there's just not that many people here today, so must not be that big a deal around the state. It is a bigger deal around the state in all counties. I remember when they had the county referendums in April of last year. There was a referendum on the ballot in La Crosse County, which is heavily Democratic, and just below La Crosse County is Vernon County, and the referendum was on the ballot in Vernon County the same day. Democratic La Crosse, Republican Vernon. They both came back 70% to change to a system where maps are drawn independently and the legislators don't choose them. So I always thought that was a very telling time. One Republican, one Democrat, right next to each other, right along the Mississippi River. So talk to people, write letters, get online, whatever, Facebook, whatever you want to do. But we know from the results of these referendums and from us going around the state with informal judgments of what's going on, there's a lot of people that care about this. The county board in Rock County put the referendum on the ballot, and they voted 22-2 to put it on the ballot. The only two that voted no, one was the son of a very prominent Republican in Rock County. The other one was my opponent in the last election that I ran. All the rest of the county board voted to put it on the ballot in favor of it. So. Which county is that? Columbia. That's why there's a November 2nd meeting, right? Good.
Well, what can you do? Yes, you're going to have to talk to your friends and neighbors, and I hate to tell you this, but you're even going to have to talk to your relatives. It's that important. I think it's also critically important that you do everything you can to get eyeball to eyeball with the people who represent you, whether it's at the county level or at the state legislature level, and say, and I can't hardly believe I say this now, all my life I said, don't be a single issue voter. There's so many issues out there that are so important, you shouldn't be a single issue voter. But I've come to learn that there's only one issue that you can say that about, and that's gerrymandering. And I think I can convince most people, again, by just simply pointing out that all we ever want out of the political process is a fair shake, an opportunity to be heard, and then to see how our representatives vote on our behalf. Well, gerrymandering prevents that. Your voice doesn't mean, I can't tell you how many meetings I've been to like this, and people will raise their hand and they'll say, well, what are we supposed to do? Our representative comes to the meetings and says, you can't touch me, and I don't even really have to be here. I don't want to be here. Well, of course that's going to make people cynical. And their hope, the legislators' hope in those cases is that if we do that to folks, they'll stop participating, and that's good for me. And you need to get belly to belly, eyeball to eyeball, and tell them, I'm a single issue voter because I believe in fairness and my right to voice my opinion about the things that are important to me and on the positions I have. And if you're for gerrymandering, what you're telling me loud and clear is you don't want me to have that opportunity. So I'm going to watch after this election, and I'm going to act accordingly. Now, there are some people who have stepped forward bravely. I know in southwestern Wisconsin, a couple of my former representatives have stepped forward and put their name on bills. When people do things that you want in the legislature, bear in mind it is a tough job. Thank them, but continue to tell them that you're watching and that you expect them to rise above partisanship and remember who they work for. They don't work for the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, they work for you and me. So that's how I would answer that question. Go ahead, you go first.
Hi, I'm Mason Kittleson. I'm the 9th grade human geography teacher here at the high school. Thank you both for coming because this is actually a very timely conversation. We just started talking about redistricting today in class, so thank you for talking about that. Kind of a multi-part question. I really just want my students to understand, the point of gerrymandering, and when I asked them, do you think gerrymandering is a fair system, all of them said no. But it seems to be a bipartisan issue that we have this independent commission system like the Iowa system. So what is an argument for why we continue to have gerrymandering? And then you mentioned, Mr. Collins, about the 2001, 1991, and 1981, we had the federal courts drew the maps. How can we switch back from that system? How did that change happen?
Well, it happened then because with the legislature and the governorship split between the two parties, they just couldn't reach agreement, and they And they agreed, though, they had an agreement that they would go to federal court. So the Republicans and Democrats at the time didn't mind going to federal court. And so that's how they went there, rather than the state Supreme Court, for example. And that could happen again, but I don't think so. Republicans undoubtedly, I think, are just going to go to the state Supreme Court. They've already got there's some cases already filed there, not directly related to these maps, but about this issue. So all the students here are ninth graders?
Yeah.
Good, great. Well, I was thinking if you were juniors or seniors, you probably were going to be able to vote by a year from November. But you will be in a couple years. So, but just because you're in ninth grade and you can't vote yet doesn't mean you can't ask a question today. So I'd love to hear a question from any of the students if you've got them. There's no such thing as a stupid question in the world, so don't worry about that. If there were, I asked a couple of them in my lifetime. Any students have a question want to ask? Okay.
Right here. You know, there's one thing that, this is a good deal more complicated than what we've made it sound here in order to get the point across in a relatively short period of time. But one of the reasons why things go to a federal court rather than a state court is federal legislation like the Voting Rights Act. And even though that's been gutted in the last few years, it's still on the books. And if federal judges feel that that it's important enough, they can take jurisdiction. And so we have to kind of wait and see what all the other parties do, and it's not just legislators, it might be what the justices do.
Sorry, thank you. My name is Jess, and I was wondering, do you know anything about where the Government Accountability Board potentially, if that was to come back, incorporating districting into that? And because that was ran by 6 independent judges, correct?
Right.
So bringing that back, yet be independent, and bring the Iowa model into that.
I think you make an excellent point, and as Tim has said, you know, when we were in the legislature, we began this nailing our 95 theses on the door, Capitol door, and we've been at it ever since. But there is no reason why any nonpartisan group couldn't do that, and the Accountability Board, I think, was outstanding. I thought it had great leadership on the staff. I think the judges were incredibly fair. The chairman of the group was a Republican, and I think anybody who watched that who didn't have a strong feeling about taking it away from them because they felt they were abused would largely say that they'd done an excellent job. So that could happen. I'm not aware of any bill in, you know, suggesting that. I believe there are 1 or 2 bills that Democrats have put forward to go to either an Iowa or a modified Iowa system, and of course anybody's bill can be amended or negotiated in a way to get an equal amount of support. But you know, that's, you know, there are folks who will say there's no such thing as nonpartisan. Well, I think the Accountability Board is an example of nonpartisanship at its best. You know, I was going to ask those students one last time, you know, I heard that you're likely going to get an A if you ask a question today. So you might be thinking about that opportunity. Go ahead.
So maybe I'll speak for the students for a second. If I were a student, and once I learned about this, I would be fearful that my vote does not count for the future. That is one reason these guys need things to change. So for you guys, how about you guys come out of retirement and run again so we can make things a little bit better.
Well, those are very kind comments, and we both appreciate it. But, you know, these students are the future leaders, and you have to make room for future leaders, and that's something we both recognize. We're willing to be of service, and we think this is of service. And, you know, I think we would certainly consider many different schemes, but I think in terms of running for office again, I think we are old enough to know better now. But, you know, it matters, and you're absolutely right. The whole point of that lawsuit, as I said before, that went to the federal court, was that people felt their votes weren't mattering anymore. In fact, we heard it 100 times at least in groups like this from people who had tried to be heard. And there are a lot of tough issues facing us. I mean, I personally feel very strongly about getting the show on the road and dealing with climate change. It's going to cost all of us some money, but it's critically important. I feel very, very strongly about reinvesting in public education, not only in the K-12 system, but in the university and the technical college level. The next generations that come up are going to have the opportunity to switch jobs and vocations as the world changes ever faster. And nothing would be more disruptive or dissatisfying than if that next generation voices can't be heard. And gerrymandering certainly will do that. Go ahead.
So to take off on that, I think, and I agree with you that young folks, and not just these folks, but people a little older than them, are our future. But what I hear oftentimes is people aren't willing to run for an office because they don't see any possibility of winning that race. And so, you know, how can we get past that if indeed gerrymandering continues to be the way things go forward? How can we get past and have people run for these offices? We need new voices, we need new ideas, and they aren't coming out because they can't get anywhere. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I always, people ask about this, I always say one of the things to do is, and you can do it in ninth grade or whenever, is get involved in somebody's campaign and just do something at that level. Go out and knock on some doors. If you don't want to knock on doors, then you just drop literature, but be around the campaign headquarters, see what you think of it. What does a campaign feel like, and is this something you'd actually want to be the candidate in? And I think it's a very easy way. You control how many hours you volunteer, and see if you like it. See if it gets your juices going. Awful lot of people I've known, including myself, worked for somebody who was involved in campaigns first before running. And regarding myself, I am, to make it very clear, 1 year younger than the President of the United States. So, but I've actually thought about it, but I think I'm really busy on doing stuff that I care about. I have 3 different foundations I started in Janesville that are related to public education, and I'm chairman of the board of Common Cause Wisconsin. And Dale and I do this, and just doing this stuff. And I've also noticed that the people in my area running for legislature, I really like them. I think they're really good. So why in the world do I need to get involved in it? So I think my time as a candidate for state office are over with. I thought about a school board a couple times, and then my daughter talked to me for a while. But I don't think there's going to be another run for office. But it was a great thrill, a great honor to do it. That's the thing that I think people who've run, I think will all tell you that they, even though it's in this sort of partisan world we're in now, I think they all feel like it was quite an honor that they had. Yes?
Nancy Long. I think one of the ways people can get involved too is locally. And I think one of the things that, and I try to be optimistic, many of your comments today give me a little more hope. But I think we're so divisive and so divided. It's hard to get people even at the local level to run for office. We've had a number of local races where there has actually been nobody on the ballot, which I think is kind of sad too, because I really think getting involved at the local level is where we learn a lot about our constituents, we learn a lot about the local issues, and so I really try to encourage people to see what's available on the local level. Thank you.
I think that was one of the reasons why the legislature functioned better 30, 40, 50 years ago. It wasn't just because of gerrymandering, no gerrymandering, but it was very common in those days that somebody who was in the legislature had been in local office first. So almost all those local offices, unless it's DA or something like that, almost all those local offices are nonpartisan. And so they got their introduction to public service and legislating, which is what you do at local level as well. And they did it, and they got used to working with other people. People didn't come in the room with a Democratic hat on or a Republican hat on. I was on the city council before I was in the legislature. I think it's a nice environment to get introduced to, that politics doesn't have to be, I'm against that person because they belong to a different party. So it's a very good idea, and it's much easier to have a campaign without much money and so on to win a local election first. Very good idea. And a lot of people have won them when they were 18, 19 years old too.
One last shot at the students. How many of you have watched this Netflix series Squid Game? Oh yeah. What's the message at the end of that? What's important in life? Family and friends. I'll tell you, if you run for office, you're going to get to have a whole group of new friends. You'll find that you have friends everywhere you go. You just have to take the time to meet them. And that's why I would say it's worth running for office, because win or lose, you're going to get a lot of friends. You're going to learn a lot about your community, and that in and of itself is worth an awful lot. Thank you for being such a good audience and for such great questions.
Thanks, guys, for coming. Well, Dale, you sure know how to empty a room. I'm going to second a couple things that were said here. One, this was an excellent presentation. We really appreciate your time. But what we need more of in politics and in the world is simply operating from the middle and listening to each other. So I applaud that these guys are lifelong friends and have opposing views but can sit and listen to each other, which is, I think, what we all wish on all of our politicians right now. With that, thank you for taking time. If anyone would like to come down, I'm sure they'll stick around for a few more minutes, and if you wanted to speak with them directly, you sure may. But again, on behalf of the Optimist Club of Lodi, thank you for taking time out of your day to come listen, and thank you both for traveling here today. We really appreciate it.